This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 531, part 2, entitled, Why are Masculists Such Misogynists? Carrying straight on. To be severely punished by not getting a man. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on fluffies to fip up, especially in the high schools, where most of the fluffy crapper damage is done. I read that in the UK lately, young men are well aware of the idea that women should study career-competent majors and look with a very cold eye at fluffies, asking themselves, when considering these young women as potential girlfriends, quote, "Is this woman a fluffie? Is she expecting to parasite off my money and labour for decades because she didn't bother to study career-competent majors in high school? I've had my masculinist consciousness raised, so I don't want to have a relationship with a woman who is a fluffy, manslaving parasite, so I'll not have a relationship with her and ignore her." End quote. It took time for people to see Negro slavery as an immoral abomination. Certainly in the 1840s in the southern states of the US, Negro slavery was just part of the scenery and unquestioned. That is no longer the case in the US southern states today. There are still millions of women, monoconscious women, who still have traditional expectations of men, seeing men, quote, as cash machines who are put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. End quote. Masculists have a hatred of such women, seeing them as immoral manslavers who are to be punished so severely that they rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected. Now for the second major example of how women viciously oppress men, namely in the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. Masculists have an even greater hatred for this category of women, since it's bad enough that they are fluffies and hence manslavers, but worse, they are seen by masculists and MGTOWs as hypocrites and genociders. They are seen by masculists as hypocrites, since these fluffy feminists, as feminists, want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men by not sharing equally the burden of earning the living, by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, thus end up as fluffies as adults and expect men to pay for them. Masculists see these fluffy feminists, especially those who control the divorce courts, brackets, which are often referred to as family courts, close brackets, namely the divorce court lawyers and judges, not only as hypocrites, but far worse, as genociders, since they made divorce so toxic for men that they have become indirect genociders, because they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So that now in many countries, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity, thus crashing the birth rate and wiping out whole populations. But these young men are merely reacting to the hated toxicity of the divorce courts, making these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges indirect genociders who have to be stopped, with bullets if necessary, since when the very survival of a people is threatened, they often go to war to stop that threat happening. Masculists have a real hatred of these fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges for the butchery they perform on divorced fathers. To understand this hatred, consider what these fluffy feminists are doing to these men. Before the second wave of feminism got going in the late 1960s, divorce was not fault-free, as it became in the 1970s under feminist influence. So fathers then tended to keep their children after a divorce, whereas that is no longer the case today. Masculists see divorcing fathers so abused and robbed by the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts that these women are truly hated by the Masculists, and for good reason. A divorcing father will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability, that is a near certainty, in many countries. So it's not surprising that so many young men are saying to themselves, quote, "Fuck marriage, fuck paternity. I'm not facing a 1 chance in 4 of having my kids ripped away from me by a hated, fluffy feminist controlled divorce court. Fuck those misandrous bitches. I'll live the MGTOW lifestyle," men going their own way, that is, refusing to marry, rejecting paternity, spending their money on themselves, and hence crashing the birth rate. A divorcing father will lose his house to his ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. He will lose half his wealth and half his stuff to her. He will make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fib up, so she continues to manslave him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. This massive injustice committed by the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges is really hated by the Masculists, since it is so outrageous, so unnecessary, since now women have a career window of half a century. Masculists see the obvious link between fluffydom and the butchery of divorcing fathers in the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts. What happens to divorcing fathers is an obvious consequence of a fluffified female population. Reversing this logic, if all women became FIPs, then the awful financial massacring of divorcing fathers that occurs in the financial courts would be removed. Masculists place enormous moral pressure on women to fib up so that the horrors of the divorce courts can become a thing of the past. These two major issues of the Masculists are closely linked